So SURTAVI is the latest in our series of trials. We ran the trial against people who weren't operative candidates, and they did better than medicine, so it's preferred therapy. We ran the trial on people that were high surgical risk, and TAVR was actually superior to surgery outcome. So now we move down to intermediate risk, because we want to find out how does TAVR do against surgery in intermediate risk. So the study design is a Bayesian statistical analysis, and I can explain that in a minute. And what we did was the local heart teams recruited people that were at an intermediate risk for surgery. We defined intermediate risk as an operative mortality between 3 and 15% that is based on both your STS and your clinical status with frailty, disability, and comorbidities. Once the heart team saw you and they found you to be intermediate risk, if you met all the inclusion and exclusion criteria, you were uploaded to a global steering committee to look at this and say, do these people really meet the criteria? If they meet the criteria, then you're available for randomization. Everybody had a neurologic evaluation, and we're stratified according to need to revascularize. So the outcomes, there was two sets of outcomes I think are important. First of all, there's the primary outcome. The primary outcome was all-cause mortality or disabling stroke at 24 months. And we found that for TAVR that was 12.4% and surgery was 14%. This was using Bayesian statistics, and we used what's called the posterior probability. And the posterior probability at 2 years was greater than 0.999. Now for those of you that are more used to Kaplan-Meier and need a p-value, if you subtract that from 1, you get the approximate equal p-value, and that's a p-value of less than 0.0001. So very strong non-inferiority. Now the other thing that you really ought to look at is look at the surgical mortality in this trial. At 1 month, the surgical mortality was 1.7% with an STS of 4.5. That gives you an observed to expected ratio of 0.38. That's the lowest surgical mortality we've ever seen in a randomized trial in the US. For partner 1A, it was 0.68. For high-risk CoreValve, 0.61. For partner 2A intermediate risk, somewhere between 0.71, intent to treat, or 0.8 as treated. Lowest surgical mortality, best surgery we've ever seen, and yet at 2 years, the mortality for TAVR was 11.4 and surgery was 11.6. TAVR stood toe-to-toe against the best surgery we've ever seen. In the short term, at 30 days, what your patients also care about, statistically less stroke, statistically less transfusion, statistically less renal failure, statistically less cardiogenic shock, and statistically less atrial fibrillation. And oh, the procedure took less time, you spent less time in the ICU, you got out of the hospital quicker, and your quality of life was significantly better at 1 month. So there's good longer term, there's great 30-day safety, and you get better faster. Pretty interesting trial. Yeah, it's really still not all unicorns and rainbows. There are some issues out there. So paravalvular leak was still more common in TAVR than it was in surgery. We've seen that in all the trials. But I will point out this was almost entirely a first-generation trial. 84% of our valves were the CoreValve Classic, and only 16% were the new Evolut R valve. We know that Evolut R from our data from Europe, which Ganesh Monahan put out, and from US that Jeff Papa put out, that the PVL rate tends to be about 3.5 to 3.8. And that doesn't even take into account our third generation valve, Evolut Pro, which has a pericardial skirt on it, which came out today here at the ACC. And what we found there was the pacemaker rate was 10%. The zero to trace PVL rate was 3/4, and mild was 1/4. That's pretty much like a surgical valve. Pacemakers, higher than I'd like to see, about 25%. Again, 16% new valve, introduced late in the trial, something I'm going to look at more carefully as we go forward. Well, I think there's some real implications from this research. First of all, this valve has such good data that I expect the US FDA to approve this for intermediate risk and approve it hopefully fairly rapidly. And what that means to me as a cardiac surgeon and a TAVR implanter is that's one more tool that I have to use for my intermediate risk patients. One more tool that I can sit down with my cardiologist and choose between. One more option for my patients, which is going to help my patients. We also noticed that the US valve guidelines came out, and TAVR is now a 2A indication for intermediate risk. That's because there was one trial. Now there's two very strong trials. The next time they do this, TAVR for intermediate risk is going to be a Class 1 indication. In the short time that TAVR has been here, it's amazing it's reached Class 1. I think future research has got a couple really interesting areas to go. First of all, this was the lowest risk group that we've ever studied with the best 1 and 2 year survival, which means we're already getting closer to low risk. we have to do the low-risk randomized trials. There's 2 low-risk randomized trials in the US right now, Partner 3, which Marty Leon and Michael Mack run, and Evolute R, which I run with Jeff Popma. They're both actively enrolling. And then of course in UK, there's the UK All-Comers trial. And so we have some great low-risk trials going on. Number 2, bicuspid valve. Bicuspid valves, even for my patients that are 80, over 20% of them have bicuspid valves. We need to study these as a field.